So welcome everybody. This week's Torah portion is Terumah. We are still in the book of Exodus. And this is actually, this week's Torah portion, and for that matter, next week's Torah portion as well, takes a very different direction, a very different turn than what we've seen the last 2 weeks. 2 weeks ago was Parsha Yitro, where we saw the in addition to Moses' father-in-law being around, but the giving the 10 Commandments, which was huge. It was an incredible experience for the entirety of the Israelites, the Jewish people. It was an incredible moment, and that's followed by last week's Torah portion of Mishpatim, which is about further commandments being given. We have many commandments. Actually, as I mentioned last week, there are dozens. I believe there are over 4 dozen different commandments being dispensed to the Israelite people, to the Jewish people. So many. Now, we still have, as it turns out, more commandments in this week's Torah portion, but of a very different and specific nature. And that actually has to do with creating a tabernacle, or really a special place for God to dwell within, or sort of be within I want to say a geographical proximate area. So as an overview, it's a really interesting Torah portion because for many reasons, not the least of which is that it is a common Torah portion that rabbis frequently will take off this week and next week, Tetzaveh. And sometimes they're actually together, Terumah and Tetzaveh, they're sometimes packaged together. This year they're separated, so we get Terumah this week, Tetzaveh next week, and we have actually the bulk of it really has to do with the construction of the Mishkan. Now, typically this term Mishkan is translated as tabernacle, which doesn't really do a lot for us in our contemporary world. Tabernacle is not a term we typically use.
Yes.
Right?
Yes, right.
But I think thinking about the Hebrew for the Hebrew, it actually it makes better sense, and I think I have a different translation for Mishkan. Mishkan comes from the root of shechan, which is really more like dwelling. It's a dwelling. So here's the verse that I really want to point out. So we have this week's Torah portion. We are still in Exodus, and it's Exodus 25 through 27. So these are the chapters we're dealing with. And I think almost the most interesting aspects are actually right at the outset of chapter 25. Although there's some, as we get into it, I'm sure people who are of perhaps an artistic bent, or maybe even people who love working with their hands, doing woodwork, metalworking, can find a lot that is actually quite fascinating in this week's Torah portion. So I'm going to start making some highlights here. So it's called Terumah. This week's Torah portion is called Terumah because God starts off by saying to Moses, "Speak to the children of Israel, say to them, and they shall take for me a Terumah, an offering from every person whose hearts move them. You shall take my offering." So it's basically and specific things are requested, not only gold, silver, and brass, which are mentioned in verse 3, but other items. It could be goat's hair, ram skins, a whole bunch of stuff, oil, onyx stones, and much, much more. All of these items. Now, what is this really going for? What is this going towards? Well, as we see in verse 8, Va'asu li mikdash, and they shall make for me a sanctuary, or really a holy place. And V'shachanti betocham, and I will dwell within them. That's that's really what it is. The very next verse 9. I'm going to show you everything. Here's basically the layout of the Mishkan. So I think this is what's really key and what's really important. This Mishkan, what is this Mishkan about? Well, it's for God, V'shachanti betocham, that God wants to dwell within, or reside within, the Jewish people, within the children of Israel. I find this deeply fascinating. What God is saying here, what?
It is. Isn't this the birth of a synagogue?
Yes. So what's fascinating, what we have here, first let me talk about this, but you're right. you are right. You're on the right track for sure. I find this deeply fascinating because God says, I want to dwell within them. This is my apartment. I think that's, to be honest, I actually think apartment or residence might be a more fitting translation, certainly for our time. Maybe people use the word tabernacle. I know in our contemporary American parlance, we do not employ this term of tabernacle. I don't even know what it means, to be honest. Like I think in American parlance, it's some sort of special holy place, maybe a sanctuary of some sort, but it doesn't, there's no real connection as exactly what it means. So I would like to say this is God's apartment. And I think his residence, and I think even more specific, I think of it to some degree almost, because it's not as if it's God's only place, right? It's not as if, oh, God is going to dwell here and nowhere else. I think this is his way of being accessible, or his way of accessing the Jewish people, being close to them. What I like to use a French term that sometimes gets used in English, called a pied à terre. So a pied à terre, which literally means foot to ground, is a expression that people use in English to talk about if they have a home somewhere, but they keep an apartment in a particular city, whether that's Chicago, LA, New York, somewhere, Paris, London, who knows, Jerusalem. People have that. It's a place for them when they go visit. They can go and dwell there. And I think that's what's going on here. I think that's what's going on here. This is God's pied à terre amongst the Israelites. And once we once we have that introduction, that sort of way of leading into it, and people are, you're welcome to read on your own chapters 25, 26, 27. What we read of there is the various furniture, the furnishings of God's apartment. And it's a table, you needed this, you needed that. And he says, look, these are the furnishings that I required for my apartment. So what we have here, God is saying, look, I want to dwell within you. I want to have my pied à terre. I want to have my apartment that I can easily access. It's unclear how much it's God's desire to easily have access to the Israelites, or how much he wants to be accessed by the Israelites. It's unclear, and who knows? It could be both. It could be a two-way street to develop that relationship with the Israelites, with the Jewish people. And what's fascinating are the furnishings that he specifies. He says, and I think anybody who, it may not be their primary residence, but they want to dwell there, they might want to have their apartment furnished in a certain way. They don't necessarily need to have everything that they need or want, but certainly enough that it makes sense when they are staying there, when they are residing there, that they have what they need, and whether it's different things. So also what's really cool, of course, it's God. So he wants really nice, he has gold and silver as part of making up the decorations and the colorings and the way it's fashioned. So God demands stuff, and that's, it's part of our relationship with God, is to accord him that honor. What?
Right.
Yeah.
And to
accord him that
that
honor. Yeah.
Yes.
And right. So that's what this week is about. It's really, and yes, Debbie, as you mentioned earlier, this is the precursor to what will eventually be the Solomon's temple, and then subsequently the second temple as well. So this is the Mishkan, and that the Beit Hamikdash, I like to call the sanctification house, but the holy temple that will ultimately emerge from this Mishkan. So the Mishkan, one of what separates the Mishkan, a huge differentiator between this Mishkan, this residential apartment of God's amongst the Jewish people, and ultimately what will become the holy temple, is the transportability, the portability of this Mishkan, because the Israelites were still traveling throughout the desert and had not yet settled in the land of Israel. What we see with Solomon's temple being established is that it is a permanent physical space. And so that is a huge differentiator. But the portability allows God to, almost in a physical sense, travel with the Israelites. And then ultimately, Debbie, and I know you were getting to this as the synagogues as well, of these what we call, it's in Hebrew we call mikdash ma'at, sort of like a little sanctuary, a little holy place, a little sanctuary, and that's something that we amongst the that's what we how we think about our synagogues these days, is that they are like a little sanctuary. They are a mikdash ma'at, a little holy place, and it allows also as like mini apartments, mini pied-a-terres, as it were, and easy. It allows for easy access for God, which, as I mentioned before, I don't know that it's necessarily only one way or the other. It could be a two-way street, that it's not just God's access to us or our access to God, but I think it allows each of us, almost in some ways, kind of like embassies, right? For diplomacy.
Yes.
That's one of the, what's really cool about embassies is that it facilitates a greater ease of access, which is important for establishing and maintaining relationships amongst different countries. And I think that's what's going on here too. It's sort of like a holy embassy of sorts, that this facilitates maintenance of relationship between God and the Jewish people. And
Now-
certainly what happens in the Mishkan, which is not mentioned in this week's Torah portion, but ultimately, and this is a spoiler, is that later we make offerings, we make sacrifices to God. So we are presenting stuff. It's not just simply there, but it's an access point that we are able to provide and make sacrifices to God there.
Now, may I ask a question, please?
Absolutely, yeah.
Is that the reason the light is burning above in the sanctuary, right in front of the Torah?
Oh, the everlasting light,
That,
the Ner Tamid.
Yeah, the everlasting light, which is a symbol of God. Is that where that came from?
Yeah, so the Ner Tamid, I actually do need to look into this. I'm not expert on the Ner Tamid. And Ner Tamid translates to, as this, as you mentioned, an everlasting flame or an everlasting light. I think it, you know what, before I say something, I will look into it. Okay, I don't know off the top of my head. I've seen them, growing up in synagogues, I've seen them all around. Specifically, they're tracing their history or what it's symbolic of. I need to look into that. I'm definitely rusty.
Thank you.
It's a great question.
Thank you.
It's a great question. Absolutely. All right. So yeah, this Torah portion, and then next week we get a little. We talked about some of the hardware of God's apartment, and next week it's a little bit different in terms of the expectations. So, but yeah, it's a little bit of a different take, and I think it also, because I know this is a Torah portion most people read if they can make it awake through. It's definitely not exciting. There's no stories that take place.
No.
And it's fairly dry, and it also doesn't directly relate to our lives these days, because we don't have a Mishkan. We're not going to make a Mishkan here in Cincinnati, Ohio. So it definitely, versus 2 weeks ago Torah portion with the giving of the 10 commandments, those are everyday things. Last week with dozens of commandments, again, so much stuff that is still so much directly relevant to our lives. Constructing God's apartment, it's not going to happen in Ohio. So it's significantly less directly relevant to our lives. But I think conceptualizing this week's Torah portion about the furnishings of God's apartment amongst the Israelite people is a little bit more of a colorful way of understanding it. And I also happen to think it's true. I just think it's a little bit more lively than just thinking it's some tabernacle. So.
Well, if you look at it in the way you've explained it, then every time you'll know why you walk into a synagogue or a temple. Do you understand what I mean?
I do, although the construction and the furnishings are different of a synagogue versus a tabernacle.
Right, because the men are separated from the women.
Well,
right?
Even if not, I mean, even without that, I mean, the actual physical furnishings are different. We don't have places to make sacrifices on.
Well, we don't have what?
Things to make physical sacrifices on. We're not sacrificing in synagogues.
No, I hope not. I hope we don't take down a goat or a lamb. That'd be
Yeah, we need to build
wild.
our synagogues differently if we need to start making goat offerings.
Yes, that's right.
Thank you so much, Debbie and Faye. Thank you so much for joining this week's Torah portion discussion. And next week we get a little bit more of that. Although, of course, the more exciting thing next week will, of course, be Purim. So that's
Let me ask you a question.
absolutely.
What chapters in Exodus did you say?
For this week,
Yes,
25, 26, and 27.
27. All right.
25 through 27.
All right, that'd be great.
Yep.
Thank
Awesome.
you
All
very
right.
much. Oh,
My
one other
pleasure.
thing.
Yeah.
Are these on the sheet or the email that you send me with all the things on it, 1870 or 51?
Yes.
Oh, they are? Oh, great.
These videos?
Yes,
Yeah, they're
yes.
included in that. Yes, they absolutely are.
Fantastic. Thank
All
you
right.
so much.
Wonderful. My pleasure. And thank you for participating. This is great.
Oh, I enjoyed it. Thank you very much.
All right. Wonderful. Thank you so much. And Shabbat Shalom, everybody.
Shabbat shalom to you.